Welcome back to another learning series with Mr. Knight. Now today's lesson will be on the menstrual cycle. Now the menstrual cycle is a hormone controlled or regulated cycle that directs the release of eggs from the ovary. It also controls the shedding and the repairing of the lining of the uterus. Now there are some facts about the menstrual cycle that you need to know. These facts are: 1. There are 4 stages. It takes an average of 28 days. So just to point out that the menstrual cycle and period, they are 2 different things. Period is a part of the menstrual cycle. Alright? Now, it is controlled by 4 hormones. It is controlled by the brain and the ovaries. Alright, most of the effects are experienced inside of the uterus. Now, the 4 stages include menstruation. This is what you call period. And so now you know that menstruation or the period is only one part of the entire cycle. The cycle is 28 days long. It's an average of 28 days long. So do not confuse period and the menstrual cycle. They are 2 different things. You also have ovulation, and you also have what they call a luteal stage. Now, the 4 hormones that are involved in the menstrual cycle, or I say the 4 main hormones, let's call them the 4 main hormones. Because there are other hormones that give other triggers, these will be the 4 that actually have direct effect on what is happening during the menstrual cycle. Alright, and just a point to note, I'm going to tell you this now, females, you're always on your menstrual cycle. You're always experiencing your menstrual cycle, because as the cycle ends, it begins again. And so you only now menstruate for a period of time, but you're always on your cycle. Okay? And so now the hormones involved, one is called FSH, which is known as the follicle stimulating hormone. LH, which is luteinizing hormone, and you have estrogen. Now there are 2 different spelling. You have the European spelling with the O, and also the American spelling with the E, but it's pronounced estrogen. And you have progesterone. Now, for you to understand what I'm going to talk about after this, I want you to note these structures and have an idea what they are. And so right here you have the ovary. Okay? And the ovary, after the ovary, it leads to the fallopian tube. But we're not going to talk about the fallopian tube, which is this area, because it only is important for us when we talk about reproduction. But for the menstrual cycle, we're not going to talk about it. But ovary is important because something is happening there, and we just talk about one of the organ or the gland that is important for releasing of hormones. And we're also going to talk about the uterus. Now, just a point to note that this entire area is the uterus. The whole thing here is the uterus. That's the uterus right there. However, we are not interested in the entire uterus. We are interested in the inner wall. And that inner wall is called the endometrium. So the endometrium is the wall that we're going to make reference to. Okay, below the uterus you have what they call the cervix. You actually call it the neck of the womb, and below that you will have the vagina. So now you understand, from the vagina, then the cervix, and then you enter the uterus. But we are only concerned about the endometrium and the ovary. So once I say ovary, talk about the release of eggs and hormones. Once I talk about endometrium or the uterus, I'm only making reference to the inner wall. All right, so let's go into some stuff right now. Now, the 4 hormones that we talk about, the first thing I want you to note is that there are some endocrine glands. So these glands I'm going to talk about right here, they are endocrine glands. Okay, which simply means they are producing hormones. So we are interested now in the brain, because remember we said the entire menstrual cycle is controlled by the brain and the ovary, because those 2 glands are releasing hormones. Now, in the brain, you have what they call the anterior pituitary gland, or you could simply say the pituitary gland, all right? And so the pituitary gland is responsible to release 2 hormones, which is FSH and LH. However, FSH and LH, they will have their effects inside of the inside of the ovary, okay? They will have the effects inside of the ovaries. Now, the ovaries will produce estrogen and progesterone. These 2 hormones, which is estrogen and progesterone, will have their effect in the uterus. So I want you to make a note. You could stop and pause at this moment and remember that the hormones that are produced in the pituitary gland will have their effect in the ovary, okay, inside of the ovaries. And the hormones that are produced in the ovaries will have their effects inside of the uterus. Okay, so hormones are produced one place but have their effects in another place, just to put that in. Now, the hormones FSH and LH that are produced by the pituitary gland, FSH, and please write this down, FSH will stimulate the growth of the follicle. So it stimulates the growth of follicles. And it also stimulates the secretion of estrogen from the follicle. So estrogen is secreted from the follicles. I'm going to see what the follicles are in a minute. Okay, and LH, which is responsible to maturing of the eggs, is responsible for maturing the eggs, and it also stimulates ovulation. And these are things that I want you to remember, because when I go deeper into this, I want you to note them. So write them down somewhere, and so you could follow me carefully when I talk about them. Okay, LH also stimulates the secretion of progesterone. Okay, secretes the progesterone. And so estrogen, which is produced by the ovary, remember now it is producing inside of the ovary, but it comes from what? The follicle. Okay, so it comes from the follicle. So notice here, estrogen comes from the what? Follicle, but it's happening inside of the ovary. Okay, and the function of estrogen is to stimulate the repairing of the uterine wall. So it repairs the endometrium. Okay, so it builds up the endometrium, make it becomes thicker and thicker. And progesterone now will thickens and maintains the uterine wall. And the uterine wall we're talking about here, folks, is the endometrium. Remember that inner wall of the uterus. Okay, so let's go deeper into this now, folks. And I wanted to make sure you have this information so you could follow me properly. Okay, now let's look at a broad picture. A very broad picture right here now. Now, the concept of the entire menstrual cycle is kind of a pointing towards ovulation, all right? And so ovulation is a midpoint. It is the midpoint of this cycle, okay, which is a very important part, because that will determine if certain things will happen or not. Okay, so before ovulation, you have what they call the follicular phase. And notice the word follicle, okay? And follicle, technically, they are the immature eggs, okay? So females are born with all their eggs that they need for their life and until the point of menopause. So you're born with all the eggs, but only release one each month, okay? Or one at the midpoint of your menstrual cycle. So one each month, because remember the cycle is 28 days. So if you only release one per 28 days, you technically release one egg per month. All right. Now, the follicular phase, which is before ovulation, include 2 stages. which is the menstruation, so which you call a period, so that's a part of the entire cycle. Remember, we talk about that. And you have what they call proliferation. All right, and proliferation is when you're preparing for ovulation and the walls of the uterus is being repaired. So think about the word proliferation and prolific. To be prolific means that you're able to reproduce, which means now if you can reproduce, you must ovulate. So proliferation is preparing you for ovulation, so you more likely can become pregnant and reproduce. All right, and then after ovulation you have what they call a luteal phase, and after the luteal phase will include what they call a secretory stage, and the secretory stage, which is dealing with the amount of progesterone that is being secreted from what they call the corpus luteum. But we're going to get into that a little bit, and you will see it on a graph system. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to understand is the two places that things are really happening. Remember, we talk about the ovaries and the uterus. Now it's time to understand what is happening in both places. All right, so the first thing here, the ovaries will produce, remember the ovaries have what they call follicle. Females are born with all their follicles, or in technical terms, females are born with all the eggs that they need for their lifetime. Well, the eggs will finish at menopause, but yes. All right, now the follicle, which is very small, eventually will grow and develop. So notice the follicle is getting larger and larger and larger. Okay, and the follicle, again, remember, it's the immature egg. Now what is important here is that FSH is responsible for this development. Okay, remember what the FSH is to stimulate the growth and development of the follicles. Follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. And so in the ovaries, the follicles are developing, and then at a point, midpoint in the menstrual cycle, at about day 14, we will look at all those, and you have what they call a release of an egg, which is known as the process by ovulation. So ovulation takes place right here, about midway. And then after ovulation, the remaining portion of the egg, so notice the egg is released. This portion right here is the egg that is being released. And the remaining portion of the follicle is known as the corpus luteum, or the yellow body. Now, after ovulation, within the uterus, the corpus luteum is formed, and then it starts to disintegrate. In other terms, it starts to break down. And when it breaks down, eventually will just disappear. All right, and remember now, I'm going to relate these structures to the hormones, but I want to see what is happening in the ovaries first, and then what is happening in the uterus. Now, in the uterus, which we're talking about the endometrium, remember the wall that we talk about, the inner wall, which is known as the endometrium. So notice right here at this location here, this is when you're starting to menstruate. That's only a part of the cycle. You start to menstruate, the wall break down, you release blood. And then after that, the walls start to build back up. All right, now remember what hormone is responsible for that? Estrogen. Awesome. Estrogen is responsible for this building up of the wall, or repairing of the wall, and also vascularization of the wall. And then now going further after ovulation, now progesterone is responsible for the thickening of this wall. Notice the wall becomes thicker. And the purpose for that is that if an egg is available, the egg can attach to the wall, and we can attach to the wall, and the female now can become pregnant. Okay, all right, so now we understand that part, what is happening in the ovary and what is happening in the uterus. Okay, and so when the wall is thicker, it can enable what they call implantation of the egg. All right, now firstly, I'm going to take this in stages, because I know I'm going to put it all together eventually, but I'll take this in stages for ease of understanding. The purpose of us being here is to increase understanding. Okay, so you're able to manage in exams and so on. So now firstly, let's look at the numbers. Remember, it's a 28 days long period. Yes, 28 days long period. So pretty much through the entire month, you are you're on your menstrual cycle. As the menstrual cycle finishes, you start the next one. So females, sadly, you're always on your menstrual cycle. However, you only menstruate at a certain time. So on average, this is average, a matter of fact, because it can vary in females. Some females may menstruate longer than some. Some females may take a longer time to ovulate. So these numbers are just average numbers, okay? So menstruation, this is when you're shedding. So this part here is menstruation, when you shed the wall of your uterus. Now, I want to notice the hormones that are happening right here. Now, for the follicle to develop, the FSH will be producing, and then you have a surge of FSH closer to ovulation, okay? And then it starts to decrease going over to the right, and that's what is happening to FSH, okay? Because the purpose for FSH is simply to grow and develop the follicle, okay? So it starts to increase gradually, and then there's a surge closer to ovulation is when the egg is fully matured. Okay, now how this is affecting estrogen, because this is what I wanted to see, how FSH affects estrogen. Do you remember that estrogen is coming from the follicle? The follicle secretes estrogen. So as the follicles are developing and getting larger and larger, notice what is happening to estrogen. So yes, estrogen is increasing as the follicles are developing. So, okay, so as FSH develops the follicle releases more estrogen. Small follicle, a low level of estrogen. Larger follicle, greater amount of estrogen. So notice where estrogen starts to peak, closer to when the follicle is very large. However, when the follicle opens up and release that egg, and the remaining start to break down, notice what happened to estrogen. Because there's no more follicle, but we have a corpus luteum instead, estrogen start to decrease because the corpus luteum will not produce estrogen. Estrogen will stop being produced by the follicle. So the level that is in the body start to decrease. Now we understand the relationship between FSH and estrogen. Let's look at another relationship right here. LH and progesterone. Now the first thing I want to remind you is that LH is responsible for maturing the egg, okay? Is responsible for maturing the egg, and that is why LH will surge closer to ovulation to make sure this egg is what? Very mature and ready to ovulate, because LH again is responsible for ovulation. LH is responsible for ovulation, and that's why LH is surging at the point closer to ovulation. Notice where ovulation is, approximately day 14, midway. All right, and then now LH, which is responsible now for the corpus luteum to form. Notice the corpus luteum form and then start to disintegrate. Now, key point. Corpus luteum is what is secreting the progesterone. Corpus luteum is secreting the progesterone. So when the corpus luteum is large, you have a very high level of progesterone. As the corpus luteum breaks down, progesterone start to decrease. Okay, so notice as this start to get small and small and disintegrate, then progesterone will start to decrease. Now a very key point I want to note right here, folks. Just if the female becomes pregnant, let's say an egg is implanted right here inside of the uterine wall, the endometrium, then there's something happened to progesterone. Progesterone will not start to go down, but it start to maintain its level, and of course you have some kind of a surge here and there, and the reason for that, because progesterone responsible to maintain this wall. So if a female is pregnant, she need to maintain a very good healthy endometrium, so the fetus can be developed, umbilical cord can be formed, and of course the placenta can be formed, and she can maintain her pregnancy. If progesterone is not increasing and maintaining at a high level or its optimal point, then the female is at a high risk of a miscarriage. Moreover, when progesterone start to decrease or in the decline, then you notice what happened here. The walls of the uterus will start to break down. So as progesterone decreases, then it will triggers the onset of menstruation or the period. Okay, so now let's jump into it all together. So this now is viewing the whole thing together. FSH and LH. Notice what is happening here. FSH is higher here because it is considered developing the follicle, and LH is lower, and then it surge towards ovulation because LH is responsible for ovulation. Then LH again responsible for this. As LH is getting lower and lower, then notice what is happening to the corpus luteum. It started to decrease as well, but progesterone start to increase and then start to decrease. And on this side, on the left side, estrogen is higher than progesterone and lower than progesterone on this side. So now it's all together now, folks, and you understand the menstrual cycle. All right, so this is the end of it. And so these are the graphs that should show you the hormones level. So on this, the y-axis of this graph will be the hormonal level. And now you understand it all together now, folks. Now you can start to enjoy your next period. And now we're at our end of the lesson. So folks, keep on learning. Just simple subscribe and share.